everyone to another episode of our career webinars. Today's we have our expert insight series because we have an expert on the matter. So I'm very happy to have him today. And what are we gonna discover today? What are we gonna talk about? So today's webinar is Discovering Behavioral Science, What, Why, and How by Juan Cruz Loureiro. And in today's sessions, we will discover what behavioral science is. We're going to explore ways in which behavioral science can be applied, and we're going to explore paths to get started in behavioral science. Before we really get into our topic, I want to introduce our very own expert. That's why we have him, because he knows a lot. And Juan Cruz Loureiro is a behavioral science consultant at Irrational Labs. He has designed and tested several behaviorally informed interventions across a range of contexts and domains, with a focus on consumer financial decision-making. He's passionate about conducting real-world experiments to understand what works and what doesn't in helping people lead happy and prosperous lives. Before joining Irrational Labs, Juan was a behavioral researcher at Duke University's Center for Advanced Hindsight, conducting applied research aimed at helping low and middle income households improve their financial well-being. He has also background in digital product management in the fintech and banking industry, and holds a master's in science in behavioral science from the London School of Economics in the United Kingdom. So he's a total expert. He has the credentials, he has studied it, he has the experience, and I'm fascinated and very happy when we have someone like this, because this is the opportunity to learn from someone who knows a lot. So welcome, Juan. Thanks for taking the time to be here with us. It is very early for you in the morning, and we have people who have waking up very early to come see you. So the floor is all yours.
Appreciate it, and thank you for overselling me so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, especially taking into account so many folks joining super early, super late. So more than happy to be able to share what I've done so far, to share some potentially interesting insights, and hopefully have a nice discussion in the end. So before we jump into what is behavioral sciences, I'm curious to hear if you all have heard about behavioral sciences yet.
That's an excellent question.
Drop it in the chat, open your mic. There's no right or wrong answers here, so I'm just curious to see what you know about behavioral sciences so far. Any brave person willing to share out?
Yes, we have Chloe saying yes. Some people have heard about it, but not in depth, not much, not really.
Okay. I like that one. The science of how people behave involves psychology, definitely.
Nice.
Okay. Awesome. Nice. Appreciate it. So if you haven't heard about behavioral sciences, it's perfectly fine. It's a relatively new field, both for academia and for practice. So this is what we're here for. And essentially, we could very easily summarize behavioral science as the scientific study of human behavior. And there are two unique traits that sort of like make up this relatively new discipline. The one is the behavioral side, which means that it focuses almost exclusively on human behavior, meaning how people behave. And most importantly, it is also focused on the practical applications, meaning that what we're trying to do with this applied field is to help people make better choices for themselves, as judged by themselves. So that's sort of like our mission statement in a way. And from the side of science, what this means is that everything that we do in this field, both from a research standpoint, but also from an applied side point, it is based on empirical evidence, both from projects and academic literature, and our ways of generating knowledge, which is a core part of what we do, is through robust experimentation that allows us to sort of like get a sense of what's going on and have a causal interpretation to the changes that we're making, meaning we do impact evaluation to understand what works and what doesn't. And what I want to tell you today is what is it that we're trying to solve with behavioral sciences? And one of the big challenges that we want to solve with behavioral sciences is simply that folks don't always behave in the way that they intend to do. So even when motivated by the best of intentions, by the best of goals, with all of the knowledge that we can have available, it is not usually the case that we behave according to those intentions or to those preferences. Think, for example, I think this has happened to all of us, so I'm also curious to hear in the chat if it's happened to you and how. New Year's resolutions. I definitely eat too much over the holidays. First week of the year, I'm planning on going to the gym. Do I do it? Very rarely. Same thing for reading more, same thing for waking up earlier over the next morning. I know this is not the case for many in our call today, but essentially, this gap between our intentions and our actions is what we in the field call the intention action gap, right? And essentially, it shows that people don't always behave in ways that they do. So to some extent, behavioral sciences plays a key role here. And this role is threefold. On the first thing that we're trying to do, that behavioral sciences allows us to do in this context, is to, first of all, to more systematically identify these gaps. Understanding that intention doesn't always translate into action gives us a unique perspective. For instance, when we ask users, what are you planning on doing? The second thing that behavioral sciences allows us to do is it gives us new tools to understand why these gaps exist in specific contexts, for specific groups of people, for specific kinds of behaviors. And third, and most importantly, the behavioral sciences toolkit adds new tools in terms of bridging that gap. So one important thing to keep throughout the presentation is even when motivated by the best of intentions, by the best of goals, and with all of the relevant information available, people very rarely end up behaving in a way that's consistent with their intentions, right? And one of the key takeaways from the behavioral sciences related to this intention action gap is that people are not as rational as we think we are. All right. So it's not like we have unlimited cognitive resources and we are constantly making this perfect effort cost benefit comparison, evaluating all of the information available, recalling with perfect memory every piece of information that is relevant for that choice in order to make every single decision that we go on. So this is in a summarized way what the rational agent model for decision making entails, right? So it assumes that we are perfectly rational. It assumes that we have unlimited cognitive resources. It assumes that we are always making this cost benefit analysis for every single decision that we make. But I think we all have the intuition that this is not necessarily the case. And one of the big takeaways from the behavioral sciences is that we are predictably irrational. Why? Because we are constantly making choices in very complex choice environments that are filled with stimuli and responsibilities that are constantly trying to get a hold of our limited cognitive resources. We have limited attention. So in a way, what we do in terms of, in order to navigate these complex worlds, and survive making lots of decisions constantly is we rely automatically and unconsciously on a series of mental shortcuts that oftentimes are incredibly efficient, that are incredibly effective in terms of getting us from point A to point B. But in many other occasions, they might lead us to behave in ways that are not aligned with what we want to do. Again, this intention action gap in a way, right? So essentially, this is what us nerds would call biases and heuristics. You might have already heard of this term, bias and heuristic. So I'm curious to see if you heard it already, if you know of any bias or heuristic that you've heard in the past. You can drop it on the chat. You can open your mic. Nope. I see a nope over there. Okay, okay. But don't worry. I know this is all relatively new, so don't worry at all. And essentially,
And that's perfect because that's the
that's
idea
perfect.
that
Absolutely.
you tell us all about that. So excellent that the audience
Exactly.
doesn't know.
We'll see exactly why we are unaware about this stuff. And I think a great way of putting biases and heuristics in a simple way to understand, which is think about them as mental shortcuts, is actually, sorry. to think about optical illusions. What's going on this image on the right? I want you all to put in the chat if you think, which of the two boxes do you think is the darkest one? Box A or box B? Of course, I am going to bias all of the answers and say that there's no doubt that box A is a lot darker than box B, right? Like if you see it, even if we all know what's going on in the back, it is obvious that box A is darker than box B. However, if we add this like gray box, we can very clearly see now that it's the same color. It's just that the context that surrounds this comparison is influencing our perception of what's going on, right? And even if I tell you that box A and box B are equal with this line, when I take this line away, it still feels like box A is a lot darker than box B. So in a way, this is what's constantly happening to us on a regular basis. The context in which we are making choices directly influences how we perceive the world and how we end up behaving, even more so than our intentions, than our previous knowledge and our goals. And what I want to show you is, I want to do a quick exercise with all of us. So what we're gonna do right now is I'm going to play this video to do a quick test. This is, I'm not testing you, this is supposed to be fun. So what you'll see is a video with two teams, team wearing a white t-shirt, team wearing a black t-shirt. What I want you to focus on is to count how many passes does the team in white make. Are you ready for this? Thumbs up if you are.
Yes, so we have to count how many passes team white does. How many times they pass the ball, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And
perfect.
We're gonna do a quick. I'm gonna ask you afterwards to type how many passes do you think they did. All right.
Okay. So this is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? No.
Okay, how many passes, y'all? If you've seen this video already, please don't spoil it yet. I see a bunch of numbers, 12, 13, 8, 16, 13. I've seen it already. All right, Helder, please hold it for a second. I'm gonna get back to you, Helder, and ask you what it is that we're seeing here. Okay, so a bunch of numbers. The answer is 13. 13, so amazing. But did you notice anything strange in this video? Like anything at all? Alamin no. Already. Okay. I see Monroe. Monroe mentioned that they saw a bear. Okay. Demlelit. Okay. Panda. Okay, there's a panda. My goodness. Nice. So let's see what happened. And I think some of you are getting a sense of what's going on. So it seems like the vast majority of us didn't notice that there was a moonwalking bear going through the video midway through the video. So let's review it and see exactly when it happened.
You see the moonwalking bear.
Okay, passes. Moonwalking bear right here, right in the middle. Unbelievable, right? So what this awareness test shows is exactly that we have limited cognitive resources. This is a psychological phenomenon known as the selective attention. And what this means is we have an attentional bandwidth. And whenever we are paying attention to something, by definition, everything else that we're not paying attention is practically invisible to us. If we had unlimited cognitive resources, we would have very simply seen the bear. However, given the fact that we do have limited cognitive resources, we don't notice that there's something incredibly weird happening in the background. Why? Because we are just focusing on the passes on the ball. And this experiment has been recreated numerous times. There's plenty of other videos and tests that continue to show this to like even with more crazy stuff happening in the background, yet most of the people fail to notice this. And I don't mean fail as in not being a success. I mean fail as which is simply don't notice, and that's part of how we perceive the world. So essentially,
This is an aware.
okay. So essentially, this is important. Why? Understanding that context matters fundamentally changes the way in which we approach this question, which is why do we make the choices we make as individuals and as societies as well? And it gives us a new perspective to understand why people make the behaviors that they do, which is focus on the context surrounding that behavior more so than on their stated preferences, on their intentions, on the available information, right? Context matters a lot. And I'm going to show you an example of what we mean exactly by this from an applied setting. And essentially, we have this situation, which is what drives people to save for retirement. And the two columns over here display the percentage of employees from two very similar companies that are currently enrolled into automatic retirement savings. So if you're not familiar with how it works in, in the US, people can define a percentage of their monthly or their weekly or the bi-weekly salary that they want to deposit tax-free into their savings account. And there's a nice thing with this model, which is that many companies offer matching incentives, meaning that for every buck that you contribute towards your retirement, they're giving you matching some part of that back. In this case, they were matching 100%, meaning that if you save $100, you would automatically be granted 200 bucks. So the 100 that you save plus the 100. So people who don't sign up for these programs are essentially leaving a bunch of money on the table, right? So the question here is, why do these companies, given that they are so similar, have such a wide range difference in terms of the percentage of folks that are currently saving towards their retirement? So I'm curious to see on the chat if who thinks that this is related to, let's say, demographic characteristics of folks in these companies.
We have someone who already shared a hypothesis.
Awesome.
Yes.
I see. Okay,
I think someone knows, right?
I love this. And exactly that's what's going on. So
yes.
Before I get into that, the first thing that they did is they asked folks, hey, why are you saving? Why are you not saving? Regardless of what company they were in. And whenever they asked folks, the vast majority of those who were saving said something along the lines of, it is important to have money for the future, whether it is for a vacation, purchasing a car, kids' education. They have this future-oriented goal that they think it's important to them. Those who didn't save, the majority of them mentioned that they can barely afford to pay their bills. So if they can barely afford to pay their bills, there's no way that they can save, right? So these are very plausible and perfectly logical explanations as to why folks are either saving or not. However, when we take a closer look at how the decision context, at how that decision is designed for each of these places, this is where it gets interesting. The one and practically the only thing that really sets apart these two companies is how the decision to save is designed. In company A, the orange one, the one with the least amount of people saving towards retirement, what they have is an opt-in design, meaning that people have to actively opt in and say that they want to save. And this means, behaviorally, it means a couple of things. The first thing is that they need to request a form. They need to define what percentage of their money they want, of their paycheck they want to send towards their retirement. They need to define what account they are choosing as the destination account. They need to fill it in the form, and they also need to submit the form to HR. So a bunch of steps in order to actively start contributing. In the blue company, the one that with 93% take up, the enrollment is done by default, meaning that they are presumed to be saving towards retirement with predefined values, meaning predefined contribution rates, typically at around 3%, predefined destination account. And what's interesting about this design is that if they want to opt out or change any of those things, they can very easily do it, following the same steps as it would have taken the opt-in process. And essentially, simply rearranging the context of that decision, the design of that decision, leads to this drastic difference in contribution rates toward retirement, which is completely unrelated to what people mention as the main reason as to why they are behaving in the way that they are behaving. So this is also an interesting takeaway, which is we ourselves are not usually aware of why we are making the choices that we're making. So even if you ask your users, what's interesting about this experience is that only a few mention that anything related to the design of the choice was influencing their behavior. And this, when I say barely anyone, it's literally a 1% of people that were replying to this survey, right? So we are vastly unaware of why we make the choices we make. So the idea here is that the context in which we make choices matters a lot. And what I want to share with you today.
이 새끼 형 미친 새끼야. 그냥 하는 동네 사람들.
Douglas, I think Douglas might have. Okay, so this the first story that I want to share with you today is that context matters, and this gives you a unique perspective in terms of understanding why people are making the choices that they're making. Think of it as wearing the lenses of behavioral sciences to see the world, right? The question then is, okay, awesome, but how do we use behavioral sciences? And this is where I think it gets really interesting. Now that we are sort of like able to see the world through a different perspective, the second way in which behavioral sciences fundamentally change how we approach decision-making is that it gives us new tools in terms of helping people make better choices for themselves. And these tools are related to essentially focusing on the context. So if the context in which we're making choices matters, then the tool that we can use in order to help people make better choices for themselves is to rearrange the context in which they are making choices. And this is what we call in the behavioral sciences choice architecture, which is essentially designing the context in which people make decisions. I'm not sure if you are all familiar with the board game Snakes and Ladders. Raise your hands if you are, but if not, I'm gonna very quickly explain what it takes. So this is an easy board game. You throw your dices and you move along a path, and essentially what you encounter are ladders that take you up or snakes that slide you down. So essentially, this is similar to what happens. So when we are making choices, the structure of the tiles, the context, influences how we approach the board, as well as the ladders and the snakes. So the first bit of behavioral sciences is understanding how the board looks like, as well as detecting where these ladders and snakes are. The second part of behavioral sciences, which is the designing solutions, is about rearranging the board. It's about taking out the snakes, it's about adding ladders, it's about changing the board in which we're playing. So let's do almost a literal example of this. So imagine that you are managing a cafeteria and you're noticing that folks are choosing unhealthy options over healthy options on a regular basis. And essentially you, as the manager of the cafeteria, you want to encourage people to eat more apples and oranges than cookies and candy. So a traditional approach to behavior change, for instance, could be to give people more information about why eating healthy is good for them, or why eating unhealthy is bad for them. This could come in the form of calorie labeling. This could come in the form of persuasive messages. And a second version of this could be to change the relative prices in this decision. For instance, make the apples and the oranges relatively cheaper than the cookies and the candy, or make the cookies and the candy more expensive than the apples and the oranges, and both of those combined. So this is more like the economics approach. And finally, what you could do is you could essentially ban all cookies and candy, which is more related to a law-based approach, but that would severely diminish people's freedom of choice, right? So none of these options are options that a behavioral scientist would explore. A behavioral scientist could do something completely different, but as simple as simply rearranging the ordering of the products in the cafeteria by essentially making the apples and the oranges more salient in attention, more attention-grabbing, meaning easier to reach, reduce the friction to access them, have them early on in the process versus later on in the process of the cafeteria, at the same time making the candy and the cookies increasing the relative friction of getting to those candy and cookies. For example, it could be instead of a see-through jar, it could be like an opaque jar with a lid on top of it. You could introduce a third person for whom you need to ask if you want a cookie or a candy rather than you being able to access it. So none of these options are either changing the relative prices of this decision, are adding any extra information that puts the responsibility on the users, or are severely curtailing any freedom of choice that people have. So, and approaches like this have been shown to be a lot more effective than more traditional approaches to behavior change. So what I mean with this example is that there is no such thing as neutral design. You always need to place the oranges and the apples somewhere. You always need to put the cookies and the candy somewhere. So there's really no alternative to this. And what I mean by this is that whether you've noticed or not, whether you are doing it consciously or not, whether you are doing this informed by evidence or not, you are already doing choice architecture. You are all choice architects. So if you are working on a product role, you're probably defining the structure of the product. You're probably defining what features goes in and where. So that changes the context in which your users are making choices. If you are working in marketing, same thing. You are defining how the user communication journey looks like. You are changing the context of how people make choices, and so on and so forth. But the big story here is that whether you like it or not, whether you've noticed or not, you are already doing it. You are in some way or the other influencing people's choice context. So the million-dollar question then is, how do we do this still, but informed by evidence? But what I want to tell you today is, fundamentally, this changes the approach in which we try to help people make better choices for themselves. So instead of using the traditional approach to behavior change, which consists of changing people's minds, meaning trying to convince them to do something that in many cases, they probably already wanted to do it anyways, what we're trying to do is rearrange the context, change the context, adapt the context to the way in which people make choices in order to set them up for success. And the oldest,
sorry,
yeah.
I want to ask you something, because I'm thinking this, and
Absolutely.
when you say, okay, let's think about how we can change people's context, I'm thinking how I can change my own context too, right? Because from what I'm hearing is like each one of us follow a certain already designed structure because we designed it unconsciously, because our family, our society, right, created a decision structure process for ourselves, and we keep on doing this because it's the way we've always done it. So
Definitely.
while I'm hearing you, I'm thinking how many things I do because I've always done them this way that led me to the same result, and how I can hack this process, right?
Absolutely.
So I'm already thinking, okay, oh yeah.
Absolutely. And this applies to helping others and helping ourselves. Like even so this is interesting. Like even when armed with all of these insights, even when having all of this knowledge that context matters, it's not like we are immune to context. Like it still influences our behavior. Like I work in behavioral sciences, yet I am not immune to the effects of context. If anything, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to redesign my own context to make whatever I'm trying to do the easiest, or to try to stop doing the things that I don't want to do the hardest. So it's managing our own context as well. Definitely, we can explore some ways afterwards about how we can do this, but definitely. And we're not going to go into details about this, but there's a process to doing behavioral sciences in practice. And this is what I work on basically, no? My job is doing applied behavioral sciences, and this means a number of steps, from defining a target key behavior, which I personally believe this is probably the single most difficult, yet probably the most important skill from the behavioral sciences, which is trying to translate big objectives into uncomfortably specific key behaviors that we want to help people do. So when you've seen this in most of the internships that you're doing, which is we tend to have very clear ideas and concepts about what we are trying to achieve. However, it is not as easy when we try to think about, okay, what is it then, the exact behavior that we want to help our users do in order to achieve those goals, right? So the second thing that we also do is, and going back to this snakes and ladders board game, we try to map out what are all of the actions, what are all of the steps that users need to do in their user journey, to map them out, and to start diagnosing that with evidence-based literature. And what I mean by this is start identifying what are some of the psychological barriers that might be preventing people from actually achieving that key behavior. There's plenty of this. It might be related to friction. It might be related to perceived value. It might be related to the way the default is set up, and so on and so forth. Once we have that, we then move on to ideation. Essentially, in the step where we design solutions, what we do is we identify, we prioritize, and we design solutions in order to implement them. And finally, this is a key aspect of everything that we do, is we test these solutions in order to learn what works and what doesn't. And when I say test, we use this experimental approach for impact evaluation. How are we doing so far? I know it's a lot of information. I see Pranav has a question, maybe a raised hand. Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna keep going then. So what I want to share with you right now is, okay, awesome. How do I get started with behavioral sciences, right? And what I want to start out by saying is there's no one set route to doing behavioral sciences. I personally have been all over the place, as you can probably see over here. So I started out studying economics because I wanted to understand why people make the choices they make. That was my mission, my motivation behind why I studied economics. Throughout my economics degree, I was told that people are rational agents that maximize their utility given a budgetary.
I think that's the basic, and for me, it's like one of the biggest lies of history. When I studied economics 101, everything I heard was, we are rational human beings, we maximize our benefit. And then I'm like, no, but my economic professor said, yes, we are always very rational. And for me, it was like,
There's definitely value, though, in the rational agent model, especially if we use it as a yardstick against which to sort of like assess people's choices. But I think we all have this intuition that we're not always as rational as the model expects us to be, both from the outcomes perspective, but also from the means perspective. Like some of the key assumptions about the rational agent model are, for instance, that we have unlimited cognitive resources. And as we've clearly seen with this example that we shared today, is that's not really the case, no? So elements in the context that, based on the rational agent model, shouldn't influence our perceptions or our choices drastically change how we behave and how we perceive the world, no? So for me, my path to getting started with behavioral sciences was realizing that my intuition wasn't necessarily aligned with what I was learning. So it was mostly a curiosity-driven path for me, no? So at that time, I started reading books on behavioral sciences. I started reading papers on behavioral sciences because I am a bit of a nerd. But most importantly, I decided to start working in industry to get closer to people's decision making. I was lucky enough to work in financial decision making for one of the largest banks here in Argentina doing digital products, which meant that I was very close to both people's behaviors at a large scale, as well as I had some levers to change the product in which they were operating, meaning that I was close to the context in which they were making decisions, and I was able to make tiny tweaks to that context and evaluate the impact of those tweaks, no? And that's when I really realized that, oh, awesome, like now that I have this strong theoretical background in economics, strong methodological background in economics, this intuition is not necessarily aligned with what I've learned so far. Practice and evidence from the field is actually giving me some validation about that intuition. I need to do something else. Like I need to properly start studying this. At the time, there was not a bunch of places where you could study behavioral sciences as a course. So what I did, I'm from Argentina, and there was nothing here in Argentina outside of reading books. So my step was, okay, where can I study this? So I applied for this scholarship, which is called the Achieving Scholarship. If you heard of it, it's great. I very strongly recommend it. And it was my opportunity to go to the UK to study behavioral sciences full time, which was mind blowing to me. Like it was an amazing experience. But after that, like now that I also had this like this methodological background around the experimental tools that behavioral sciences requires, as well as some more theoretical knowledge about psychology, biases, heuristics, why context matters, and so on and so forth. I was like, okay, how do I apply this now that I have these tools? And I went back to digital product roles, but this time in the fintech industry at a little bit of a larger scale. But it allowed me to sort of like start playing around with these new insights that I had learned. And eventually I had the chance of working full-time as an applied behavioral researcher at the Center for Advanced Hindsight, which is a unique place, much alike Irrational Labs as well, in the sense that even though it uses all of the rigor from academia and robust methodology, it is nice because we worked in partnership with industry, meaning that we got to do our science, but apply it in the real world. And that meant a number of skills from project and stakeholder management to experimentation to product and so on and so forth. But that is my journey. It doesn't mean that it is the only journey. And fortunately, I think there's plenty of ways to get started with behavioral sciences these days. There's undergraduate courses, there's postgraduate courses. There's a number of online resources that are great. So I guess here the story is, mine is more like serendipity, luck, and curiosity. Yours could be any other story, but what's foundational for the field is that it's a multidisciplinary approach, meaning that you have people coming from different branches of knowledge with different experiences. So I think I've never worked with another economist, for instance, in any of my projects. And people come into the field with their own unique perspective.
And at your masters, Juan, the people who did the masters with you, what were their background?
Everything. So from all over the globe, and everything really. We had folks from design, we had folks from sociology, we had folks from the health industry, we had folks from policy, well, economics, of course, psychology, but really super diverse. So what I mean by this is there's plenty of paths to get started with behavioral sciences, but there's also plenty of opportunities to apply behavioral sciences as well. And this is relatively outdated now, but it is estimated that there's over 880 organizations around the world that are using behavioral sciences in one way or the other. We're going to see this in more detail, but most of those organizations are in the private sector. So let me walk you through what are some of the top organizations doing behavioral sciences. So the first way in which you could apply behavioral sciences is in academia. This could be applied research or non-applied research, but there are plenty of great places to do academia for behavioral sciences. I'm just highlighting a couple, like Duke's Center for Advanced Hindsight, which is where I used to work. We also have UPenn's Behavior Change, LSE, the Inclusion Initiative, which I strongly recommend you take a look at. But there's lots of great institutions doing amazing research on the field. There's also lots of opportunities to do behavioral sciences in public policy. No? So there's a bunch of countries that have their own government offices fully dedicated to doing behavioral sciences, or that had behavioral sciences teams embedded within government offices. And there's a bunch of them, most of them amazing. There's also opportunities to apply behavioral sciences in consulting. So on the one hand, we have non-NGOs, not-for-profit organizations like the Behavioral Insights Team, the Inter-American Development Bank, Bursara, Ideas 42, the World Bank's Embed, most of them related to development. Not all of them necessarily, but many of them. And also, many of these organizations really committed to making behavioral sciences a field that has a diverse audience of practitioners. And this is something that's super important for us as a field, I think. And then we also have for-profit consulting companies, which do also amazing work. For instance, the work that we do at Irrational Labs, we get to partner with organizations of the like Google, TikTok, Walmart, like huge scale organizations working on top priority projects, which is an amazing experience. There's also other amazing organizations, each of them focusing on a specific domain, but plenty of opportunities to do consulting in a for-profit environment. And again, there's plenty of opportunities to do behavioral sciences directly in companies, directly in industry. There's lots of organizations, and many of them are from the tech domain, but not all of them. But what I mean by this is that even so, whether there's an explicit role of a behavioral scientist within an organization, or it's a skill that a team is using in order to help their users improve their lives, there's again plenty of opportunities to start exploring behavioral sciences. But aside of that, I think it's important to sort of like go over where some of the core skills that a behavioral scientist uses on a regular basis. By no means is this meant to be like you have to have all of these skills. Again, it's a multidisciplinary approach, so it's the complementarity of skills. But on the one hand, we have research and experimentation skills, which require being able to critically assess academic literature. Like our shared language is both experiments and academic literature, so it's important that you can critically assess the quality of a study. Statistical analysis to be able to understand relationships between variables, experimental design, both quant and or qualitative research, and ideally some expertise with experimental softwares. There's also a bunch of product and design skills that are super critical to the job of a behavioral scientist, for instance. And I think this is probably the most important one, which is being able to translate evidence into practical applications. And this sounds easy, but it's often a challenge, no? Like going from the paper into the reality of a product. It's lots of fun, but it could be a challenge as well. Again, basic product design, being familiar with products or services development process, because you need to, every intervention is intertwined with that process. And again, some analytics and A/B testing skills to be able to sort of like generate your own data and assess value. And finally, there's some project and stakeholder management skills that are required for the role. Probably the most important one is being able to communicate complex concepts into single terms for a wider audience to understand. Not everyone that you work with as a behavioral scientist is going to be fluent in behavioral sciences or no behavioral sciences at all. So it's important that you can very easily convey some of these complex and key concepts in ways that are understandable to each specific audience, right? That being said, I think personally, the two most important things that make for a great behavioral scientist are, first, being super curious. The process of doing behavioral sciences is about understanding what works, what doesn't, constantly updating your knowledge. And if you really want to do this at scale and over the long term, it has to be something that gives you curiosity. So that's one thing. And the other one is, based on the fact that we are using the process of science, you have to be willing to learn. You have to be willing to continue growing your knowledge, and you also have to be willing and open to some of the things you thought were true not necessarily being true. You have to be willing to update your knowledge on a regular basis. This comes both from running experiments that you thought were going to work that don't necessarily work, as well as checking out a paper that says something completely different from what you thought was happening. So that is, I think, the two most important sort of like intangibles that make for a great behavioral scientist. I'm not sure how we're doing with time.
We have, I think, like we can move to the Q&A part now, because we have amazing
Good.
questions in the chat. People are already asking, and I see some are can't wait for your answer, so they're asking ChatGPT. So we have one question that asks, how can individuals use behavioral science principles to improve their own decision-making or habits?
Amazing, amazing. And I think there's two important parts to that question. One is just knowing that this is happening won't change any of how you are behaving if you don't change your context. So that's one important realization. Knowledge alone is probably not going to change any behavior. The second part, and probably the most interesting one, is if we know that context matters, there's plenty of ways in which you could sort of like reframe, redesign your own context. whether it's something that you're trying to help other people do or yourself. For instance, I am trying to read more lately. My great intervention to reading more lately is I purchase the physical book, have it nearby to where I am sleeping, and I typically try to have books that I haven't read before in my bookshelf. So I use a number of principles. One is I create an abstract goal into a tangible object that is already there. It also operates as a reminder, not just a reminder, but a timely reminder. So the location of that reminder is also very important. I see it close to the touch point where I am planning on making that behavior, right? And there's a number of ways in which this there's a number of ways in which we could apply this at scale. For instance, pre-commitment devices are great. Commitment buddies are great as well. Thinking about what is the current default that you're using. Being aware that we tend to have confirmation bias. For instance, we tend to seek out information that aligns with what we previously believed. So it's a great strategy to design an experiment to confirm that intuition rather than go seek strategically for that information that confirms our beliefs, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think it's endless opportunities here.
So someone else asks, how can the application of behavioral science principles can help me become an outstanding and productive in my career as business analyst?
As a business analyst, okay, that's a great question. Okay, let me break it down. So remember attention. People focus their attention on whatever is most salient at the moment of making a decision, right? So oftentimes we believe that all of the work that we do is evident and obvious to others, whereas in reality, others might be focusing on how many passes the team in white makes rather than focusing on the work that you're doing in the back as the moonwalking bear, right? So one important strategy there is to make it salient. Another nice strategy is a concept that I really like, which is the concept of reciprocity. And what reciprocity shows is that we have a tendency to want to do good things or to want to reciprocate for folks that do good things for us. So this might come in many ways. It could be about lending a hand to someone that you know is having trouble with something. It could be about giving people feedback. It could be about requesting people for feedback. There's actually nice evidence showing that reframing feedback into advice leads to better developmental tips from the advisor. So that's another interesting way in which we could use behavioral sciences to like find new ways to grow our careers. And finally, I think this unique perspective, you can think of it almost as a comparative advantage to people that don't necessarily have this. It will allow you to think about problems more creatively. It will allow you to base your recommendations and your opinions on evidence, which is key. And it's not, at least in my experience, doesn't always happen as much as we believe it happens in work environments. So yeah, I think those are some of the strategies that would be interesting and that could potentially be low-hanging fruits.
Amazing. Someone asks, is there a difference between organizational behavior as a course and behavioral science?
Great question. I think the honest answer is that I am not sure. My intuition, though, is that there might be places where they overlap, but there might be places where they don't. So I'm not super familiar with the literature around organizational behavior. As long as there's human behavior involved, I think there's an opportunity for behavioral sciences to have a say in that field. What I'm not sure if existing sort of like courses or materials on organizational behavior account for this unique perspective from the behavioral sciences, right? Take, for instance, economics. Economics is focused on trying to understand why people make the choices they make. However, they use different insights, different perspectives in terms of getting to those answers than behavioral sciences do. Similar thing might be happening with organizational behavior. Honest answer, I'm not super sure. So this is just, take this as an opinion.
And someone asks, how can small changes in daily routines based on behavioral science principles lead to significant improvements in productivity and well-being?
Okay, that's amazing. I think the answer is in every possible way. And actually, what the evidence shows is that it's actually those small changes that are more likely to change your behavior in the moment, but also over the long term. So yeah, any concepts that you can incorporate, any tiny tweaks that you can incorporate in a way that are based on evidence, or in a way that we have some confidence that can predictably change our behavior in ways that we want it to be changed, are definitely the way to go.
There's this book, right? Atomic Habits, that explains that, right? That's one of,
yeah.
I read it, it's really, well, there are
Yeah.
many.
And
Yeah.
there's a bunch of evidence showing that interventions that are super successful in terms of influencing people's intentions don't necessarily translate into changes in behavior. So I think the shift in mindset here is we're not trying to change people's intentions. Oftentimes, intentions are really greatly aligned. The problem is that we rarely get to behavior. So behavioral sciences tries to change the context to facilitate that behavior, but it's focused exclusively on behavior. So we only care about intention insofar as it allows us to understand behavior, but like we focus on behavior.
Well,
So,
there's
yeah.
a saying, right? Like the path to hell is full of good intentions. Like
Exactly.
we may
Exactly.
have the best of intentions, but okay, what do we do actually, right?
Exactly.
So I love to hear, because we need to wrap up. I love to read what great takeaway we are taking with us today. For me, the main thing that I guess it resonates is how the context matters, right? And you said how intention is not enough, that we need to make sure that we're looking at context. And for me, that makes me feel like now I need to reapproach many things. Definitely. Let's share your LinkedIn profile, because people have been asking how
Yeah.
can they stay in touch
Over here,
with
right? Yeah.
Juan.
Yeah, feel free to reach out. I am not super responsive, but I am always happy to have conversations about the field. So feel free to reach out at any time. More than happy to help you out in any way that I can.
And I have one question that I want to address before we wrap up, because I think this one is interesting. Where do we draw the line between helping people make better choices and simply tricking them into decisions we want?
That's an amazing question, and one that I could talk about for hours. So I'm gonna try to be succinct. So on the one hand, what we're trying to do is help people. What helping people means is oftentimes difficult to define. So there's a huge philosophical question around how do we define what's good for people? There are plenty of approaches. One approach is literally trying to bridge these gaps. If people are saying that they want to do something that they are not being able to do, I think that's the easiest way of helping them out, right? The other path is we ourselves might not always know what is best for us, or we might have preferences that are not aligned today. What we know is good for us tomorrow. So that's a different strategy. But there are plenty of strategies. What's important across all of those strategies is something that we call libertarian paternalism. That is our whole approach to behavior change. And even though it does sound as a couple of contradicting words, it has sense to it. So on the one hand, we're trying to be paternalistic in the sense that, and this goes back to the fact that there's no neutral design. We're trying to be paternalistic in the sense that we are always, whether we like it or not, trying to prioritize a behavior over a different behavior. So there's really no alternative to being paternalistic. We could be better or worse paternalistic folks. We could pretend like there's a way around not being paternalistic, but the truth is that there's context matters, and regardless of what we do, we are going to influence people somehow. So the idea here is make sure that you are focusing on that and that your intent is helping people in some way or the other, that you have a very clear path to justifying why the key behavior that you are trying to solve for is a good key behavior for folks. If you cannot find an answer to that question, it's probably not going to be a great key behavior to focus on. The other bit, which is the libertarian aspect of libertarian paternalism, is that we have the utmost respect for people's free will. And what I mean by this is the approach of behavioral sciences, the foundational stone is that we never want to force people into any decision, nor do we want to limit their freedom of choice. So there always has to be an alternative to the key behavior that we're trying to target on. Actually, if I have an intervention and the take-up rate of my intervention is 100%, I will definitely take that as a failure, because there's no chance that every single person wants to do that one thing. So we are always, no, it's not that we're trying. We always have to allow people to choose whatever they want to choose. We are going to prioritize probably one of the options, but we always want to allow them to choose whatever it's best for them. So I think that's sort of like a quick summary of that amazing question, one that is super, super, super interesting. And yeah, as a field, we have to debate at all times.
Now I'm thinking how I can learn more about this. Like now this is amazing. I'm taking away this great thing you mentioned, that there's no such thing as neutral design, right? So I think that's also a big takeaway to understand. Even the things we design for ourselves, for our workspace, for our internship, they have an effect, right? So if we want to have a certain result, we should revise this design to make sure that is this non-neutral design helping us or not, right? So
Exactly.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Juan. This has been super interesting. I think we could stay for hours, but we all have things to do, you included especially. So thank you again for being here with us today. Thank you. Thanks to the audience, that we have people that are in
I really
6
appreciate.
a.m., 1 a.m. I don't know. It's amazing. So thank you everyone for having shared this moment with us. And I will wait for you next webinar in 2 Wednesday. We have a new webinar, so I will see you all there. Once again, thank you, Juan, and hope you have a nice day in Buenos Aires. And for the rest, I hope you have a beautiful day, whatever you are in the world, or a good night, because I know some of you it's already bedtime. So thank you once again.
Thank you all so much for the amazing questions, and my pleasure. More than happy to share some of the cool stuff from our field, and hopefully it is helpful to you moving forward.
Amazing. Bye-bye, everyone.